Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week we are doing another two-part series. We just finished our four-part series on the Third Reich, but we're jumping in on another series. And this week we're going all the way back to ancient Rome, and we're going to focus on the Roman rise and fall of the Roman Republic. And with me, I'm joined by Josiah Osgood, who has written his most recent book is Lawless Republic: The Rise of Cicero and the Decline of Rome. Um, Thank you so much for coming. And well, what is it about the Roman Republic to you? So, if they compare it to the Roman Empire, and what is it to you about that fascinates the Roman Republic more than say the Roman Empire?
Yes, well, we're all fascinated by the Roman
Hmm.
Empire, by
We all think
its
about the Roman
military
Empire a lot.
conquest, by its games, gladiators, all these things. People don't think as much about the Roman Republic.
Hmm.
But one thing that fascinates me about it is that it survived for so long. The tradition places the Roman Republic's beginning around the year 509 BC, and it lasts, let's say, to the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. So that's over 400 years.
Yeah.
There's no other republic in history that has lasted that long.
If I
The
may,
United States
actually, if
right
I may
now, where
chime in, yeah. If I may
the
chime in, one
United,
may say the reason wasn't really that there wasn't, at least in the beginning and until it defeated Carthage, there weren't really any many empires to be a rival against Rome. That's perhaps one of the reasons they survived as long as they did, that there weren't many rival empires that were to fight against, perhaps.
yes. Well, of course, there was a one traditional
Yeah,
rival of Rome, which was Carthage.
yeah,
Carthage really is kind of the sister of Rome. It's another republic, right? Based in North Africa, just a few days journey from Rome. And it amassed actually earlier than Rome did its own empire, but it was an empire based on the sea. Then, right, sort of in the middle of the Roman Republic, you have the rise to power of Macedon, the
yeah.
great empire of Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, and then especially Alexander the Great. So there are various empires that are rising and falling. And Rome, of course, comes into conflict with both of them, Carthage and the Macedonians, and Rome ends up winning. But yeah, in the West, right, in Italy, there was no rival empire, really.
Mm. So let's begin with the budget. And I know both you and I are not too familiar with this period of time, a more later period of the Roman Republic. Let's begin with the founding of the Republic and, the throwing of the last king of Rome. And that this would be a cliche throughout the entirety of the Roman Republic and pretty much even until Julius Caesar's time the emperor was kind of a king in itself, or in all but name. But we'll get back to that next time. But let's begin with the founding of the republic and how this would change Rome forever.
Yes, so it's very important that we mention at the start, we do have histories of this period, of the foundation of the Republic, of the first years of the Republic. In particular, there's a writer named Livy, and he's a lot of fun to read. He tells very wonderful stories, but most modern historians, myself included, don't think that what he is telling us is much more than mythology. So it's kind of a tough situation to be in because we have these wonderful stories, and I'm going to tell you the story here in a
Yeah.
moment. But just keep in mind, right? The Romans really started to write their history down only at the sort of the end of the third century. So around the time of the war against Hannibal.
Mm.
So they told these stories and they were important. They may reflect some of what happened, but they're not likely to be entirely accurate.
It was more of a, I think Adrian Goldsworth put it in his book on Carthage that, it was more of entertainment and not necessarily to be historical accurate. It wasn't like being an academic in the 21st century or later times, but it was more earlier times. Sorry, not later, but it was more for entertainment than, say, historical accuracy. Same goes with most ancient authors of the time.
Yes, ancient history was meant to be entertaining, stories of bravery, success on the battlefield, defeats. And also, it was meant to be instructive, to teach you how to be virtuous and to give you warnings about what would happen, if you behaved tyrannically. So, this is very much true about the story of the Republic's foundation. What we're told is so Rome had a series of kings. The first king, very famous, Romulus, right? He created the city of Rome, and actually, he, in doing so, killed his twin brother, which is a very shocking story for the city's foundation. But Romulus was a king, and according to this tradition that we have, there were seven kings altogether. And the last of these kings was a guy named Tarquin, Tarquin the Proud, the Romans called him. And he, by all accounts, right, ruled very tyrannically. He was obsessed with buildings. He built a great temple to Jupiter in Rome, but he required the people to, almost as the Romans viewed it, to act like his slaves to get all this work done. So there was unhappiness, but there was a particular crisis that brought him down. So he had a son, and this son of his was kind of like a playboy, just liked to party, didn't have any of the virtues even his father did. So his son um, and a friend of his, they were sort of having a discussion about who, when they were off fighting war, about who had the best wife in Rome. And they came back to the city, right? And found what the women were doing. Some of them were partying, but there was one woman, a lady named Lucretia, who, even though it was late at night, she was up working hard with her slaves, her enslaved woman. She was weaving. And this was a very virtuous activity for a Roman matron. And the son of Tarquin immediately started to want to possess her sexually. He kind of lusted after her. So he secretly came back at a later time at night, and we are told he raped her. And she was ashamed, right? Because she had lost her sexual virtue. So, according to the tradition, she ended up killing herself, kind of in a heroic suicide, to say, I'm not going to be a precedent for any woman in the future to do wrong. But the men around her, her husband and others were so upset at this outrage that they ended up deciding to throw out the king along with this son who had committed this terrible crime. And a very important figure is a guy named Lucius Junius Brutus. He's really the mastermind of the plot to get rid of the king and the king's family. And that name Brutus sounds familiar if you know Roman history. He's
I see.
allegedly the ancestor of the assassin of Julius Caesar.
It goes in the family.
So there's a problem though. This is, when we get into tradition, right? The sort of on these great stories, but perhaps not completely accurate. We are told that so virtuous was this Brutus, right, who got rid of the last king, that actually his sons tried to plot to bring the king back. The king wasn't killed, he just went into exile. And he fought a war against the new republic to try to regain his throne. And Brutus, right, had a couple of sons, and they joined in on this plot to bring the king back. And Brutus was so horrified that actually he killed his sons, right, because they were committing this treason. So, actually, he didn't have any heirs who survived, yet Brutus, at the end of the Republic, claims to be descended from him.
Mm,
But clearly, this story is all about the Roman hatred of kings. Romans did not want to be ruled by a king. This
mm,
is really the point that the story is making. When you give one man or his family too much power, eventually they will abuse it, and it will cause problems for the people, cause problems
mm.
for even the upper classes. So
A
it's a
lesson
very,
perhaps for the 21st century as well.
yeah, I mean, obviously, modern the story is very familiar to us, right?
Yeah.
Familiar to Americans who lived through the 18th century. We don't want to be ruled by a king anymore. Familiar in more recent times, right? And this is
Mm,
what makes the Roman Republic amazing and influential, even though it eventually gave way to emperors, right? People are remembering in the 18th century during the French Revolution that we had this other idea that the people can rule themselves
mm,
and they don't want to entrust too much power to one individual.
mm. So now what? It's thrown at the king, and everyone is happy, happy, happy. And what do the rebels do next with their new formed little republic?
Yeah. So Brutus becomes what we would say is the first consul, and he has another colleague. So the basic idea of the Roman Republic was that you would have more than one supreme magistrate. You would actually have two. And the name actually changes a little bit over the years, but we can just say two consuls. And the other important point is so power is shared, and then the consuls should only hold office for a single year. Then they rotate out of office and you elect new executives. Okay. So this is the basic idea of the Roman Republic is we're going to
Yeah.
share power and we are going to have term limits of just 1 year. This is how much they don't want a king, right? Um, so this system, right, at least according to the literary sources, right, is immediately put into place. In reality, it probably took quite a bit longer to figure out exactly how to do it and to get enough buy-in for it. But what we're told also, right, is that in these early years of the Republic, after the kings, there are a lot of crises, right? The king's trying to regain power, so he has to be defeated. There also is a war with Rome's neighbors. So Rome is one city-state. It's on the Tiber River, close to the sea, and it's kind of on a relatively flat and fertile part of Italy, the Latin plain. So there are these neighbors, the Latins, and they get into a war with Rome, and Rome, we are told, defeats them. Just this isn't just the first few years of the Republic, and Rome, we are told, right, imposes a sort of treaty on them by which they have to cooperate with Rome in future wars. And this is a really important pattern in the Roman Republic. Part of why the
Yeah.
Republic rises to power is they're very good at sort of figuring out legal arrangements with other people in Italy so that they get military support.
Mm. One of the things I think we should mention as well is that, at least in on paper, the Roman Republic were only fighting defensive war. Again, notice that I said on paper it was very thin line on what they would consider defensive war, so that they would only gain territory by fighting defensive war. They were never the aggressor, or at least according to themselves. So that's one of the main things about the Romans as well. They were only would only gain territory. And again, I think it's easy to compare like Poland in 1939, right, where Hitler said that, oh, the Poles attacked, we are attacking in Poland because they attacked our soldiers. They staged the coup that we talked about this last a few episodes ago with on the Third Reich. But for example, just then to an example how loose this defensive war was for Rome as well. It was kind of like when Hitler staged the attack on German soldiers with when he attacked Poland. So it was kind of similar to what I would say what the Romans were doing when they called it defensive war.
Yes. Yeah, it is a real paradox, right? If you
Yeah,
only are fighting defensive wars, how do you become the greatest empire that Western
yeah.
Europe has ever seen? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So maybe these wars weren't always defensive, but you are onto something in the sense that the Romans did care about public opinion, right?
Yeah.
And they had a very developed a very legalistic point of view, right? So they did try always to give a pretext, a stated reason for a war. Now, obviously, you're an enemy of Rome, you're a victim of Roman imperialism. You may think it's a lie, but it does matter in rallying your own people to war and your allies if you can make a better case rather than having no case for the war. So I
Mm.
think it is important that you mention that.
And I want perhaps highlight one of the closest neighbors and one of the most famous ones at that in the area, and that is of course the Etruscans, who supposedly been there 1,000 years, according to the legend that they would only last 1,000 years and then the rain would fall. But let's talk about the relationship that Rome had with the Etruscans. I think maybe one of the most famous neighbors of the Romans.
Yes, so the Etruscans uh, are a fascinating people because their language is not a member of the Italian language family, unlike many of the other neighbors and the Romans themselves who spoke Latin, which was an Italian language. So it was kind of a mystery. Where did the Etruscans come from? They had a very sophisticated civilization.
Do we
They
still
were
not
expert.
know where they come from?
Well, Herodotus, the Greek historian, says they came from the east. Actually, a modern view is that nowadays that maybe they'd been there a long time and that actually Etruscan is a very, very ancient language to Italy. But certainly what we know is that they were very good traders. Some people said they were pirates. It's kind of the same thing sometimes in the ancient world.
It is a
They
thin
were very,
line.
yeah, they were very good craftsmen. They made beautiful metalworks. They uh, produced excellent pottery. So very, very wealthy cities who sometimes formed up in a league to try to organize themselves to have more power. The last few kings, including Tarquin, are said to have been Etruscan. And this may reflect sort of the real fact that Rome actually absorbed a lot from the Etruscans. So eventually they would defeat them, militarily and place their own colonies there and require the Etruscans to support Rome in Rome's wars. But actually, fairly early on, Rome was probably influenced by this very sophisticated civilization, which kind of was it in turn influenced by the Greeks.
Yeah.
And I think this is one thing that's sort of surprising sometimes, um, if you haven't studied the Roman Republic that much, is of course that there are lots of Greek colonies in southern Italy. So the Romans, the Etruscans, they were all influenced in turn by the Greeks.
Mm. Isn't the alphabet said to have come first? I just mentioned the influence from Greece. Isn't the alphabet one of those that came from Greece, then the Etruscan, and then the Romans again adapted the Etruscan alphabet into the Latin alphabet?
That's right. Yeah.
Now, before we go to the unification process itself of Italy, I want to talk a little bit about the Roman Senate and how the Roman Republic actually functions. If you could tell a little bit about how, the decisions were made and how who could have staff for office. And I believe mostly the richest could, yeah, even in the early days of the Republic, that could hold office. So how was there corruption at this early stage on as well? So how did the Roman Senate and the Roman Republic function in the early days of before the rise as a superpower?
Yeah. The Senate is a fascinating institution, right? According to tradition, it went back to Romulus, and the first senators were sort of his advisors, kind of like an advisory board, or an executive board for an organization. So they were supposed to advise him. The Senate lasts in one form or another, I think until like maybe the year AD 700. So, okay, maybe it wasn't actually created by Romulus, but let's put it around the year 500. I mean, that means the Senate existed for over a
Yeah,
millennium. I mean, incredible. What organizations are that old today? Only maybe certain
yeah,
religious ones. So clearly the Senate was very good at adapting, even as the Roman constitution changed. So who were these senators early on? Well, we're told, right, that the early history of the Republic is dominated by Rome struggling with its neighbors in Italy, but then also internal conflict. And the conflict is between two groups who are very neatly called patricians and plebeians.
yeah.
And the idea is that the
Caesar,
patricians,
I think Caesar, of course, was a plebeian as well, famously.
Caesar was patrician.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So the plebeians, it's easier to figure out who they were. They are sort of the ordinary people of Rome originally, and they suffer from debt, they want land, they have a lot of political grievances. So they sort of form a movement. It's kind of like a labor union today or protest movement. They kind of form a movement. And what they do is they withdraw from Rome. They refuse to offer any work. They won't fight in wars unless they get their rights recognized. And it's a long process, but eventually they do. And they sort of integrate their own assembly into the Roman state. The patricians are the other side. And there's debate about who they actually were, right?
yeah.
But according to Roman tradition, they're the descendants, for the most part, of the first senators
Mm.
created by Romulus.
If I
The
may,
father.
mm, if I may, was it to do a comparison? Was it kind of like what England has, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, in a way? In that sense, is it kind of the same?
Yes, it always is the case that the patricians, right, are are defined by birth. You have to belong to a certain family to be patrician. And this is, true for Julius Caesar, right? Born in
Yeah.
100 BC, so towards the end of our story, but he came from a patrician family. Okay. So what happens though is so the Senate originally, right? This is all a little murky, as I said, but originally the Senate seems to be the patricians, and then over time others get to join it. And we eventually will reach the point in which the only way you can join the Senate is you have to be elected first to a political office by the Roman citizens. So it shifts from being a hereditary body into one that is elective. Although, of course, if you belong to the right family, it's easier to get elected.
Mm,
But just one more word about the Senate. It clearly becomes a very, very important institution. And in a way, it's kind of the governing body of the Republic. So you have these magistrates that we talked about, like the consuls, they're the ones who command in war.
mm,
So they're very important. But the Senate kind of decides every year which wars are we going to fight? And how many troops are we going to send? And what is the budget going to be? Um, and of course, once they become people who have held office, they build up a huge amount of experience and they really know how to fight wars. So the Senate becomes kind of a huge part of the Republic and works closely with the magistrates to ensure the state's success.
mm. Now, how democratic were, because we know that at least later in the Republic, only rich people were allowed to vote, as well as it was the case in ancient Greece. But how democratic were the Roman Republic at this point?
Yeah, so this is one of the fiercest debates in recent years in scholarship. A British historian named Fergus Miller recently died, but in particular, he mounted a very strong case that Rome actually was a democracy. We call it a republic, that's what the Romans called it, but he said it was a democracy in the sense that the people ruled.
Mm,
And how does that work? Well, the people elect the magistrates, and very importantly, the only laws that can be passed have to be passed in the assemblies of the people. So the citizens would come into Rome. You did have to be in Rome to vote, and you could vote yes on a law or you could vote no. And you would,
mm,
cast your ballots in elections. So from that point of view, right, Rome does look very much like a democracy.
yeah.
And the people had a lot of power and really were sort of the arbiters. They can make or break a political career. Okay, where it gets complicated, though, is how were the votes actually weighted? How were the votes valued? And this is where some people say, well,
Mm,
Rome really wasn't that democratic. Because the way these assemblies were structured, for instance, in the assembly that elected the consuls, if you had more money, your vote counted for a lot more.
mm. Kind of like a
It's,
veto route in a way.
yeah, the details are very complicated and they're sort of fun to try to figure out. But you can read, for example, Cicero writing in the late Republic towards the end, and he was sort of very happy about how all these arrangements were created so that a majority of very impoverished citizens would not get to choose who became the supreme leader of the republic. The system was really designed to prevent that. So I would say, it is a type of democracy, but probably not the sort of pure democracies we're used to nowadays.
Mm. Now, of course, I want to bring into light, of course, this famous SPQR, Senatus Populus Chair Romanus line that is you can still find in on the in Rome today. So when did this line come into play in the Republic years of the famous SPQR, line?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's not attested until sort of maybe the second century
Mm,
BC or so. But of course, one of the issues is we don't really have a lot of sources, especially contemporary sources
yeah.
from earlier than the second century BC. So I mean, this is one of the points about the debate is often if you're referring to the Roman government or the Roman state, you would actually just say the populus Romanus, the
Mm,
Roman people. Um, but sometimes you start to see in administrative documents, right, treaties with a recognition of other kings and things, you do start to see this senatus populusque Romanus. So
mm,
it occurs in the Republic, but I don't think people would go around on the street, and see SPQR
mm.
actually as much as you see it in modern Rome today, when it's like on the
Yeah,
sewers, in the trash cans, it's all over the place.
that was not the case back in Rome.
Yeah, not as much. You start to see it on coins too, but that's really actually beginning with Augustus and the
Yeah.
emperors. When they want to, Augustus has actually gained a lot of power, but he wants to pretend that the Senate and the people still matter.
Mm. Now, before we go into the Roman conquest, I also want to talk about the Roman army a little bit of the Republic in these days, because and again, was it on mostly the rich people, the same as again, same with the Greece, where you had to, that could only apply for the army until, of course, the famous Marius reforms, which I believe we will talk about next week. But was mostly the who could apply for the army and what was the army like in those days until it became the almost unconquerable army. I'm sorry, the unmatched army as we may know today that when we think about Roman army, we think about the red, armor and etc. The red helmets and everything. What was the Roman army like? And I mean, armor and I know you're probably not a military historian, so they don't have to go too much in detail on this, but just give us a brief view of what the Roman army of the early days was like.
Yeah, this is an area again where, our sources are particularly unreliable because writing so many years afterwards, they very often project the reality of the army of
Mm,
Caesar's day onto
yeah.
much earlier times.
And
So
also, if I may interrupt a little bit again, and do forgive me, but I want to mention that a lot of people think that the Roman soldier army was always this what you think of the iconic Roman soldier with the red army and the spear, etc. But the army evolved. I mean, take a look for it wasn't always like that. Even in the third and fourth century, it was quite different from, like you said, what was in Caesar's day. What we think mostly of the Roman army, it evolved from, say, what we think of the Roman army in movies, for example, that we only see one type of soldier, but that wasn't even in ancient Rome, and it was quite different from Caesar's day.
yes, yeah, yeah. The Roman army in movies is yet another layer of
Hmm.
distortions, but awesome as they always look in the movies. But yeah, I think a basic point I would make is that probably in the early Republic, the army is sort of more like the hoplites of the Greek world, so heavily armed. And then the Romans still have their own cavalry in this period. So probably the wealthy guys were the cavalry. This changes, and by the time of Caesar, as you probably know, right, a lot of
Mm.
the cavalry is actually Germans or Gauls or people from Spain or wherever, North Africa. So there's a very big change, though, that happens, and we're not sure about the date. But one kind of convenient theory is it sort of happens around the same time as the rise of Alexander the Great. So that makes it easy to remember. And Alexander's father, of course, reorganized the hoplites into this very awesome phalanx, right? Where they, had these incredibly long spears. The Romans sort of went in the opposite direction and they shifted to a more flexible type of military formation in which the soldiers were put into smaller groups. They were called maniples, and there were maybe 120 in this group, and they could be shifted around tactically. And they were armed with throwing spears and then eventually swords that came from Spain, these double-edged swords that could be used in very close combat. And it was this gradual series of reforms, right, that really made the Roman army an incredibly lethal force, right? That these guys would sort of get right up against the enemy and slash them to death and use the spears in the initial part of the battle to try to break up the enemy formations. So, yeah, these reforms, whenever they happen, however they happen, they clearly were very important. What later happens is the tactical group becomes a bit bigger, and you have the rise of the cohorts, which is more like 500 men, and that becomes sort of the main unit in the army.
Was there many auxiliary units at this time, or would that come later? Like you said, with the
Well,
Spanish, German, etc.
yeah, I think for the cavalry they stayed the Roman citizens were on horses earlier on. What seems to have started though pretty early is is using other peoples in Italy to fight alongside the Romans in all kinds of roles.
Mm.
And this is part of how Rome became dominant, is they were just so good at mustering manpower. And they could take a terrible loss in battle, and then the very next year they would be ready to
Mm.
go. They would have enrolled new troops. Um,
Well, we will take a look at this, of course, in the
kind of interest,
Carthage War.
yeah, yeah, and we'll talk about this with Carthage. It also goes back even a little bit before those wars. Uh, Maybe we'll talk a little bit about King Pyrrhus. He
Mm.
was a sort of successor to Alexander the Great, and he was summoned to southern Italy in the year 280 by one of the Greek city-states down there because they were getting into a dispute with Rome. Rome was really encroaching now on southern Italy.
Mm.
And Pyrrhus, showed up, right? And he technically won all of his battles against the Romans, but he had this very famous line, one more victory and I will be defeated. Because what happened was, even though he won, he cleared the field,
Mm.
right? He was actually sustaining losses, and it was hard for him to replace his forces, whereas the Romans kept on fielding armies. So he eventually, 5 years after he came to Italy, he had to flee. He had to go back to the Greek world.
Mm.
And he brought along a Greek diplomat with him. And the diplomat gets all of these great lines, which are clearly designed to make the Romans look very good. And one of the things he says is, these the Roman army is sort of like the Hydra of Greek mythology. You cut one head off of it, and then a couple more grow
Mm.
back. So clearly this really grabbed
I
the
understood
world.
that reference.
Yeah. this really grabbed the world's attention. I think when this Greek king, he brought elephants to Italy, a very large army, maybe 20,000, when he gets defeated or has to give up anyway, fighting the Romans. This is when Romans really start to to draw the attention
Mm.
of the rest of the world.
Yeah. So let's talk about when the unification of Italy is complete, and of course, how powerful were Rome at this point in time? They're not an empire just yet. Of course, they won't be until the time of Caesar. But how powerful were they at this time?
Yeah, so the unification of Italy, right? Of course, that sounds familiar because in the 19th
Mm.
century, right, we speak of the very
Yeah.
same thing, the unification of
Yeah.
Italy. And
But of course,
obviously,
back in the 19th century, you have other powers such as the British Empire, France, and Germany. Yes, and that one didn't threaten. So it's the same, but also different because back in the 19th century, you also had all these other powers, world powers, and colonialism was at its height. So this same, but also a little bit different at the time.
yeah, completely. So what I'm trying to say though is so Italy actually is a Greek word originally. It's probably a Greek translation of an old Italian word that meant the land of the calf, like a young cow. So a sort of referring to Italy as a very rural or rustic place.
Hmm.
And there were other names that the Greeks called Italy as well. Sometimes they called it Hesperia, which meant the western land. So so it starts really just as a geographic term. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Romans turn it into a political unity, which is a very distinctive process, even though it kind of sounds familiar to us because of modern history, because of the modern Italian nation state. It was a very long time in the making. So, it starts with the Latins and these local peoples who, are sort of forced, sometimes they want to,
Hmm.
sometimes they're forced to go into alliance with the Romans. Um, the process, though, right, really picks up in the fourth century. So early Rome is facing all these political questions and struggles with plebeians and all of these things. Uh, in the year 367, though, we are told a bunch of laws get passed that really help to resolve a lot of the political disputes. And remember, it's shortly after this time, probably, that Rome starts to reform the army, right? Change the style of fighting. And it really goes, whatever they may say, it goes much more on the offensive in Italy. Okay. And the details again are very complicated, but one of the things that the Romans do very successfully is they send out colonies throughout Italy. And there are different types of colonies. Some are of Roman citizens, and those, at least originally, are meant to be defensive. You put them in places like on the coast or elsewhere where you feel you might face military problems. The other type of colony is the so-called Latin colony. People there don't have full Roman citizenship, but they have some rights. And this is a way a little less directly to spread Roman authority, right? To put these
Yeah.
colonies up and down the Italian peninsula. Now, eventually, Latin colonies end, and in fact, eventually, around the year 180 or so BC, the Romans stopped colonizing in Italy for about 100 years because they've effectively spread their power. But that's a very key development in spreading Roman authority. The other thing that goes with it, very famous nowadays, right? All roads lead to
Yeah.
Rome. So the Romans around the year 300, a little bit earlier, start building these military highways. And their purpose really is to be able to move the army quickly at all times of the year.
And
And
it's ironic that this will become one of the most famous aspects of Rome, its empire, how the amazing roads that they would build.
absolutely. And, that is, we're in this sort of interesting situation where we call it the Roman Republic,
Hmm.
but they actually are inventing all of the techniques they will use as a global imperial power. So colonies, for example, and roads. And roads are a theme in ancient empires. The Persians had a wonderful road system long before the Romans did. So the Romans are kind of inventing things that work well for them in Italy, but in the process, somewhat knowingly, somewhat unknowingly, they're becoming a Western Mediterranean, then eventually, a Mediterranean, a global power.
So let's talk about another power that reside on. We talked about this power earlier, the Phoenicians or Carthage, as they're well known. Let's talk about the relationship between Carthage and Rome at the time. We know that the Etruscans traded well with Carthage when they were still a civilization. But what about the Romans? And when did the famous rivalry that, of course, will later become known as the Carthaginian Wars. When did that occur? And so let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Carthage and Rome.
Yes. So Carthage is the city-state in North Africa. It was a Phoenician colony originally. And then, so Phoenicia is where modern Lebanon is. And the uh, Phoenician homeland sort of slips into to decline. And Carthage really assumes the position of leader, especially of the Western Phoenician colonies. So it becomes a very prosperous city-state, and Carthage is very comfortable with maritime power. I mean, the Phoenicians were wonderful sailors and sailed right across the Mediterranean. And one of the reasons they did that was to get resources, so precious metals, for example. And the Carthaginians definitely continued that tradition. We have a couple of treaties that a historian writing in the second century BC claims he found that actually go back, the first one, to the very early years of the Roman Republic. These are treaties between Rome and Carthage. And the very first treaty is interesting, right? Because it shows that Rome is, really just head of a sort of league
Mm.
of cities and the area around it
It was they
itself,
were kind of
nation
in
in
they were
Italy,
kind of
whereas
in yeah.
Carthage,
Sorry for interrupting you, but they were kind of insignificant until after the Carthage War, in a way.
yes, yeah, that's my point is you look at these early treaties and you can see
Yeah.
Carthage is actually a much more powerful empire because
Mm.
it has all of this land in North Africa, right? And land is a huge
Mm.
source of wealth for
They
Carthage.
did they
They're
have
very
land in
good at
Spain as
agriculture.
well.
Yeah, and they have interests in Spain early on, but they're particularly dominant in Sardinia and part of Sicily, actually. And of course, if you think about the map, right, that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
not that far from North Africa. We're talking about modern Tunisia, basically, is the homeland of Carthage. So Rome and Carthage actually seem, as these treaties suggest, seem to have managed to get along pretty well for a long time. And sort of they're interested in each protecting their own turf, right? And Carthage in particular doesn't want Roman traders or pirates, right, encroaching on their territory.
Mm.
It all changes though, right, with that war that we mentioned against King Pyrrhus, right? This is what the Greek king, sort of in the style of Alexander the Great, who shows up in southern Italy, right, allegedly to free the Greek cities. He may be trying to build his own empire, but he brings the army, he brings 20 elephants, and Rome kicks him out, right? And I think this really empowers the Romans, emboldens them. So what happens is just a few years after this, uh, there's a call sent to Rome from a city in Sicily, right, in the northeastern part of the island, so just across from the Italian mainland, the city of Messana. It's Messina today. And this city it was an old Greek city, but had been taken over by some Italian, it's sort of like an Italian gang of sort of pirates or thugs almost.
Mafia.
Yeah, perfect. Let's say mafia. Yeah, and they're called the Mamertines, actually, which means like the people of Mars. Okay, so a tough crew. And they kind of get into conflict with a major Greek city of Syracuse, which is further down the coast there on the island of Sicily, a great city, very powerful once upon a time. They defeated the Athenian navy back in the day, so it's a powerful place. So the Mamertines get into a conflict, and they actually call on both Rome and Carthage for help. The Romans show up and they decide that they are going to help the Mamertines in northeastern Sicily. And this is really the start of the First Punic War. That's what we call it in hindsight, right? So basically what happens is the Romans help the Mamertines, and Syracuse initially fights the Romans, and there's sort of a siege around the city of Messana, but then they give up and they decide to go along with the Romans. And that leaves the Carthaginians, right, who are now very worried. If the Romans come to Sicily, this could mean the end of Carthage's control of the western part of the island. And that is a key part of the Carthaginian Empire. So that's really how the war starts. And this gets into the question, right? Is Rome acting purely defensively
Yeah.
at this point in time? It seems a little hard to say that's the case, right? On the other hand, I think nobody in Rome had any idea that they were about to get into a war that would last for 25 years, more or
Yeah.
less.
Now, here's the thing we need to point out as well is that, of course, we mentioned the Roman army, and Rome is, of course, known for having a navy as well, but up until this point, that navy didn't exist, and the navy was more of a Carthaginian thing. So let's talk about how that would be an advantage in the early wars with Carthage against Rome, especially for the Battle of Sicily. So let's talk about the advantage and how the Romans would eventually adapt and build a navy that would become the famous Roman navy that we know them as today.
Yeah. So our literary accounts say that, Rome stumbled into this without any navy. They had no clue about building
Yeah,
ships or anything. Uh, there's been some doubt cast on this, right? Because after all, Rome had these colonies all
yeah,
over the coastline of Italy. Probably Rome, at least traditionally, had relied in part on sort of local sailors and local ships. If we need some naval uh, protection, right, we call on our allies, or some of these colonies might have had small fleets. But it's true that the Romans seem not to have had a very major, naval fleet at this time. So the story gets told, right, that they they have to build this fleet up. And the way they do it is they capture a Carthaginian warship, right? And then they figure out by looking at it very closely how to copy it. And then they start to build one, and then they build a bunch of ships. So this takes a little bit of time, right? But they build this fleet. What we're also told, though, is that they still felt a little bit kind of nervous, right, about taking on the greatest maritime power of the West. So they add their own innovation, right, which is kind of like this plank, a huge plank of wood that will, with a spike on the end of it. And the idea is they go out to sea and then they um, drop this plank onto the enemy ship so then that the Marines, right, can run across and fight the Carthaginians on their own ship, as if it's a land battle. It sort of works for a while, although it seems to make the ships very top heavy. So it's not really a lasting innovation in naval warfare. But the Romans, initially they do succeed, right? And they have a couple years into the war, a pretty big naval victory at Mylae in Sicily. Uh, what happens though is they then get more emboldened. They decide they're going to try to invade North Africa to bring the war into the Carthaginian homeland. And as they're moving across the Mediterranean, a couple of times they lose their fleets in huge storms, so that the Roman commanders seem not to have been the most competent. It can be bad luck, of course, but seem not to have been the most familiar with kind of the conditions of naval warfare. So
Mm,
that scares the Romans off because, building a fleet is very expensive.
mm,
It's one of the reasons why Rome, actually, if it didn't have to, didn't want to maintain huge fleets and would just say, okay, you give us your ships for this year because we need them, but we're not
mm.
going to pay for them ourselves.
Now there we have to mention, of course, a famous chicken story that takes place under the Punic Wars, and that is, of course, with the famous Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher. So let's talk about and give some context to this famous chicken story that takes place during the First Punic War.
Yeah, I'm forgetting all the details, but the basic story, right, is he's the commander, and the Romans, a huge part of Roman life is religion, and we tend not to think about it as much because it's very alien. Military power we can understand. Roman religion is definitely seems very different
Yeah,
to a modern reader. But they always they feel that the gods, right, if you treat them nicely, will bring you victories. And you don't want to do anything against the will of the gods. That's the other side of it. So they have this habit, the Romans, of sort of looking to the natural world for signs of the gods' favor or their disfavor. And one of the special things they develop is the use of these chickens. They're called sacred chickens, and you're supposed to not feed them. And then eventually you drop some, little grain or whatever into the cage. And if the chickens eat it up, that's considered a good sign.
yeah,
Surprise, surprise. So maybe the result is a little
mm,
predetermined. But anyway,
yeah.
the story is that Appius Claudius he fed the chickens and they wouldn't eat. So then he said, "Well, uh, I'm sure they will drink anyway." So he throws them all into the sea, and drowns them. So they'll
Yeah.
definitely be drinking. And then he
Well,
proceeds to lose his fleet afterwards. So this became,
wasn't there something with his sister as well or something that she cursed him? I don't fiance, wife. I don't remember the exact detail, but I think there was something with his sister or something that was pissed off at him
Yeah.
back in Rome as well.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things with his sister is so these are the Claudians, and they have a reputation for arrogance,
Yeah.
right? And remember, looking forward, the second emperor, Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, he was actually from this Claudian family. So it became very interesting later on to resurrect these stories about the Claudians. So the story about her, one of them anyway, was that she, I think, was going to games in Rome, and she was in a special kind of carriage and was being brought home, I think, from the games. And there were so many people on the street. She was very upset because her special carriage could barely move. And she said, "Well, I wish that my brother were still around to lose another fleet so that he could thin out the crowds of all these people in Rome." And, according to some versions of the story, she actually got in trouble for saying that, because it was considered almost
So,
sort of like treasonous or something. Yeah.
so much for brotherly love.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the Claudian family always stuck together, right? But at least their critics said, and then they ganged up on everyone else.
Now, of course, one of the most famous generals on the Carthaginian side, and I think it's time that most people should be know who this guy is of course, Hamilcar Barca. So let's talk about his involvement, of course, and how he would become such a famous general during the First Punic War, and later his son swear his son for hatred against Rome. And we will get back to his son later, of course. I don't want to spoil anything yet, but those who may have figured out who I'm talking about, of course, is should know. Doesn't know, they know. So let's begin to talk about Hamilcar Barca for a little bit during the First Punic War.
Yeah, so Hamilcar Barca is a general, and the Carthaginian military is different from Rome. So they do have this incredible navy, but especially on land, they tend to rely on mercenaries. They would hire people in Africa or sometimes from elsewhere, even from the Greek world, Spartans or whoever. They would hire people to fight in their wars. And the Romans were always convinced that that made them weaker. That it was better to have your own citizens fighting because they had an interest in seeing the country succeed. So, but Hamilcar was a very good general. And a lot of the Punic War is sort of this series of sieges in Sicily. There's sort of a fight, city after city after city, to by one side or the other to gain control of the island. And Hamilcar is there in Sicily and actually doing pretty well in holding off the Romans and winning and so on in these sieges, and thought he had a chance he could win the war. But what happened was that the Romans finally built a another fleet, remember, like 20 years or so practically after the first one. And they end up winning in a very big naval battle, the Battle of the Aegates Islands, a little bit west of Sicily. And Carthage at that point gives up, right? The loss of that fleet was just too much for them to bear. So they end up deciding the government in Carthage ends up deciding to make a peace with Rome. Now, you can sort of talk about the terms of that peace. Some people say it's kind of a very hard peace. Some people say, actually, maybe it wasn't so hard. Um, what Rome did immediately afterwards, we can talk about.
Yeah.
But Hamilcar seems to have felt betrayed, right, by the government in Rome and sort of felt he had been, might have had a chance of winning, but he was just prevented now by the
Is,
civilian.
do you think he had a chase there that he actually could have won the war if he given the chance, or is that just, how he felt? And again, I'm going to do a comparison to the Great First World War, where the German soldiers felt that they were betrayed again by their government and they was stabbed in the back. But and again, there's kind of similarity there, but should he actually, I mean, know from research now that that's not the case, that wouldn't have stood a chance in the First World War, but was this the case with Hamilcar as well? Should he have won the First Punic War if the government has given him a chance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I honestly will say I'm not sure. Um, I I feel that afterwards, though, it kind of becomes the line he uses, right? And so the story is that he will go off to Spain, and start to really build up a new empire for Carthage in Spain. So in the aftermath of the war, right, Carthage has been defeated and they have to give up Sicily. That's one of the terms of the peace. So Sicily becomes the first really overseas territory of Rome. Although, Romans might have thought this is kind of really almost still part of Italy. And they
Yeah.
don't immediately make any arrangements, to have a permanent governor, for example, in Sicily. What happens though is the mercenaries back in Carthage are very upset that they haven't gotten all their pay, so they rebel. And it's a very bloody war back in North Africa. And the Romans pretty much seize the opportunity to grab the island of Sardinia, which had not been in the first treaty. And that causes a lot of bitterness in Carthage. So Hamilcar Barca, he goes off to Spain. And even though Carthage looks like it's been brought to its knees, Carthage has an amazing ability to rebound.
Mm.
After each of the wars against Rome, the first and the second, it always kind of comes back. So he starts to amass power in Spain and really develops, especially some of the mining operations. There's a lot of silver in Spain. So he kind of rebuilds the Carthaginian Empire, no longer in Sicily, Sardinia. It's now based more in Spain. And of course, he takes his young son with him. And that son is none
Mm.
other than Hannibal.
Will be famous and swear that he will revenge Carthage, and of course, famously he does. So let's talk about the rise
He
of
has to swear
Hannibal.
the oath. Yeah,
Yeah.
young Hannibal is made to swear an oath by his father. This may be a Roman story, but it's sort of true, even if it's not literally true, right? He has to swear an oath of undying hostility to the Romans.
Mm. So let's talk about the rise of Hannibal and then what would eventually be the Second Punic War. I think we're going to end the episode after the Second Punic War and conclude the third one in the next episode. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of Hannibal before we go in. And he had quite a large shoes to follow, and it's ironic that he would become even more famous than his father.
Yes, he becomes, one of the great generals of world history and a model for none other than Napoleon, right?
Yeah.
Who, when he invades Italy, he's very consciously thinks he is following the footsteps of the great Hannibal. And there's that very famous painting by David showing Napoleon crossing the Alps.
With
And
the
on one of the
gravestones, right?
rocks, yeah, and on one of the rocks is written the name of Charlemagne, but then also
Yeah.
you have Hannibal.
Yeah.
Like Hannibal is more of a model even than Caesar in some ways for Napoleon. So yeah, so Hamilcar Barca is there. Then his son-in-law took over Spain for a while, and then eventually control of that part of Carthage's empire falls into the hands of Hannibal. And the Romans do start to get nervous, right? Um, they had fought the Carthaginians in this long war. It was 25 years. They know they're a formidable enemy. And they do start to wonder, what is going on in Spain? And could this be the rumblings of trouble for us later on? And this is where, we can say the Romans were always maybe not purely defensive, but they were always worried about their security, right? So Rome is kind of busy fighting these wars in northern Italy. And this is important background for Hannibal as well. The Gauls. We haven't talked about the Gauls,
Yeah.
but they're actually in a way kind of the great enemy of the Romans, even more than the Carthaginians. They invaded or migrated, we should say more neutrally, they migrated into northern Italy in the period of the Republic, and they started to, from the Roman point of view, cause problems. Harassing Romans, going on plundering raids, etc. And
Again,
actually,
it's kind of the same narrative, right? And there are now a lot of analogies here, and sorry for interrupting you so many times. It's kind of the same narrative that right-wing people have in the 21st century about immigrants in today's society. It's kind of similar to the Roman view of the Gauls in the Roman Republic era, in a sense.
yeah, it's one of the themes of the whole Roman Empire, right?
Yeah,
Is sort of migrations from people of the
yeah.
north and the difficult relationship that Rome and the Roman government sometimes has with these people. So anyway, why am I talking about this? Well, because the Romans, after the First Punic War, they spent a lot of their energy fighting these people in Gaul, in northern, what we would call northern Italy, but the Romans actually called that Gaul, that part of Italy. And they're ferocious warriors, so it takes a lot of work by the Romans. Um, the Romans had this memory, just jumping back in time a little bit. The city of Rome was sacked by Gauls around the year 390. It was the one time, until we get to the late Empire, that Rome was sacked. So it's a very
Mm.
kind of painful, like a trauma, we would
Yeah.
say almost, as far as the Romans are concerned. So they're very busy with that. And that is kind of part of the background of Hannibal, because what he decides is he's going to think about how he can use the Gauls. So Rome is dealing with the Gauls, but they're worried about Hannibal in Spain, or at least the Carthaginians in Spain. So they set up an agreement with Carthage that basically is supposed to create kind of spheres of influence, we would say nowadays. This is at the Ebro River in northern Spain. And the idea is basically that Carthage needs to confine itself south of the river. Rome was not occupying Spain at all, but they just don't want the Carthaginians moving any closer, right, to Italy than that. What happens, though, is then a city south of the Ebro River, a place called Saguntum. This is kind of like the start of the First Punic War. They send out one of these calls for help to Rome. And they say, wouldn't you please like to, be our ally and protect us against Hannibal? It's true that this had not been part of the Carthaginian Empire, but it was south of the Ebro River. And the Romans decide to go help. They decide that they are going to become allies of Saguntum. Okay. So this for Hannibal is kind of the trigger. This is the trigger. But he, I'm sure, has been thinking about his plans all along for how he's going to get back at Rome. So he, there's a diplomatic back and forth with Carthage. The Romans kind of give Carthage a chance to back down, but even the home government has had it. And they say, we are willing to fight you again, Rome. So this is when Hannibal puts his very bold strategy into action because what he does in the space of a year is he marches an army with a lot of war elephants, right, that he's brought to Spain. He marches, up through Spain, through southern France, as we would call it today, across the Rhone River, and then goes through the Alps and lands in northern Italy,
Yeah.
okay, with some of the elephants surviving. Not all of them made it. A lot of his men died too, but he gets there very quickly, 218 BC.
And
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 the
again, if I
Gauls join
may,
him.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that crossing the Alps for almost until up until modern times would pretty much be the same in Napoleon's days, up until pretty much only up until the late 19th century. It would be pretty much the same as crossing the Alps to, for the next 1,000 years. Nothing would really change. It would still be as challenging moving armies across the Alps, or pretty much throughout the entire history of the wars fought between Italy and Europe. So it's really fascinating and difficult. It actually is to cross the Alps from pretty much up until modernity.
Yes. And, obviously local peoples there
Yeah,
knew how to move through the mountains and so on, but it could be very hard for an invader.
yeah.
And Hannibal was there pretty late in the year, when the snow was already falling, and he still made it through. And this just caught the Romans completely by surprise. I think there's no doubt about it. They sent an army earlier in that year, 218. They sent an army to Spain. They expected they would be fighting there, but Hannibal snuck around and made it into Italy. So this became a huge crisis for Rome. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting and shows the shrewdness of the Senate is even though they sent that army to Spain, they actually decided to keep it there and to fight the Carthaginians there. And while that might have been tough in the short run, that actually helped them to prevail in the end because it meant that it was harder for Hannibal to get reinforcements from Spain. The other place he could get reinforcements, of course, is from North Africa. But remember, the Romans now mostly control Sicily and have enough experience
Yeah.
in naval warfare that they do a pretty good job of keeping that from happening also. So, so Hannibal, though, the one other thing we should say is the Gauls were one part of his strategy. I think the other thing he was hoping for was that there would be a lot of defections of of the other people of Italy, who had been conquered by Rome, as we've been saying, over the last century. And he was hoping that he would sort of cause kind of a breakout. He was there to liberate, right, people from Roman tyranny. That was his claim, and it didn't really work out.
So let's talk about the con or not. I'm not sure conquest is the right goal because even though we possibly could have, he never does conquer Rome. So let's talk about what his work in Italy as a and the fight against the Roman army, what would be the Second Punic War, because it's like you said earlier, the Romans would again be defeated, but still they would build themselves up again almost instantly with a new army. So let's talk about almost like, and then I know that a lot of analogies today, but it's almost like the Russian army as well, when it comes to the Roman army of the Second Punic War.
Yes, I think very much so. Yeah, the Roman army is very hard to eradicate. Um, And that I mean, this is kind of why for the Romans later, the Second Punic War is their greatest hour. That they were severely put to the test, but society rose to the challenge. And if you read, like British textbooks about Roman history, they always kind of compare or traditionally they would compare the invasion of Hannibal to kind of like the crisis of Dunkirk,
Yeah.
when Britain feels completely isolated, it's lost the war in France, but the citizens rally, right? The people rally in Rome. So what happens militarily? Hannibal has a couple of major victories, and he's very clever. He's very, we're told that Hannibal is sort of he's kind of like Odysseus rather than Achilles. He's
Yeah.
very good at tricks and deceptions. Uh, so he figures out sort of ways to try to surprise the Romans, even to use their own strengths against them. So one of these battles at Lake Trasimene, he ambushes the Roman army, relying on some fog in the morning that can hide where he is and what he's doing. This reaches its culmination in the year 216 at the Battle of Cannae. And this is Hannibal's masterpiece, right, in tactics. Basically, so this is in southern Italy, and Rome has already lost a couple of major armies. And there's talk in Rome of, maybe we should just sort of wear him down, right, rather than keep fighting these huge battles. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But they decide to raise another big army, and they send it to southern Italy, and it's a very hot day in summer weather. And what Hannibal does, right, is to simplify, but he sort of lines his men up, and he puts cavalry and stronger troops on the sides of his formation, and makes the middle a little bit weaker. So what happens is the Romans, right, who have this very aggressive style of fighting that we've talked about, they go plunging forward, and they sort of think that they're winning. Okay. So they move forward, and then at that point, Hannibal swings the sides around so that he completely encircles the Romans. And this is just the definition of a military disaster, right? To be
Mm.
encircled on all sides. And the Romans fight bravely, but they are
Mm.
just plowed down, and they lose, numbers vary, but
Mm.
tens of thousands of Roman citizens die on
There is
that
a
day.
famous line, of course, that's it's a joke, military joke that says, "So we're surrounded. Great. Now we can attack from all sides."
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so this is the point, when another state possibly would have thought about giving up or capitulating, but certainly the Romans wouldn't. And I do think one thing about this struggle in general is that, I mean, even though the Carthaginians relied on mercenaries and so on, these are both republics ultimately that are fighting each other, right? And this people on both sides are sort of committed for various reasons to winning. And so it is, a bit like the War of Athens and Sparta in the 5th century. It just becomes a consuming struggle. So the Romans decide that they are going to stay on and fight. This is the moment when people say Hannibal should have marched on Rome. And I think, there you can kind of make a case, maybe he should have been very aggressive, and he might have possibly brought Rome to its knees. It would have been tough. The city had walls and there were other people who would fight, but he didn't. And the Romans shift into what we call the Fabian tactics. And there's this consul, former consul, a guy named Gaius Fabius Maximus, and he really says, uh, we can't keep losing armies like this. So we have to use Hannibal against himself. And what we have to do is just sort of pin him down and but not fight in wars so that he gradually loses support. His men may go hungry, right? They lose enthusiasm, and eventually we will win. And for a while, that is what Rome does. And it was definitely strategically the right decision. And, this was actually one of the inspirations for George Washington in the
Mm,
Revolutionary War when he's fighting the British, have a much better army and more resources by far than Washington did. He sort of becomes the Fabius Maximus, and it's a tough thing in Rome because they're aggressive and they want to win. And Fabius is saying you just have to wait. You just have to wait. You just have to wait. So the Romans hold on for a while. Hannibal does get a few of the old Roman allies to defect in southern Italy. Rome is furious, and those people will be punished eventually. But they finally, have these men in Spain who start to win, and then Rome starts to win elsewhere. So, for example, Sicily, the city of Syracuse, their old king died, and they go over to Hannibal's side. So that's another defection against Rome. So the Romans send their general Marcellus, and he ruthlessly besieges the city. This is very famous because Archimedes, the mathematician and scientist, engineer, he's there to help defend Syracuse. This is another thing where we get lots of legends. Like he has mirrors so big that he can burn Roman ships with the
mm,
sunlight that they shine on them. I don't think it happened. But anyway, so the Romans start to win elsewhere than in Italy. And that's kind of the story of the Punic War. The Second Punic War is
mm.
eventually Hannibal starved of resources, morale low. Eventually he will have to go back to North Africa.
Mm. Now, what is Scipio Africanus? And of course, we will talk more about him in the next episode. What is his role in this? Because he will famously go against Hannibal as well. I mean, we talked about the famous again. We will talk about the famous meeting in the next episode. But what was his role in the Second Punic War?
Yes, so his father and his uncle had been fighting the Carthaginians in Spain, and they were successful, though they both were eventually killed, defeated. So Scipio was very young. He was in his 20s, and he somehow kind of builds up this mystique at a very early age that he's going to be the one, that he's favored by gods um, to defeat Hannibal. So he goes to Spain first himself, and he has a strong rapport actually with the Roman people. The Senate is very worried. They don't like the idea of this young guy having all this power. But this is where, the people ultimately have say in things. So they ensure he gets commands, he gets elected to office. So he went off to Spain and had a couple of great victories there. He also made an alliance with the king of Numidia, a guy named Massinissa, who was also very young at this time. He'd been helping Carthage, but he decided to go over to the Roman side. So this prepares the way for Scipio to go to North Africa. And, Scipio works hard to train his army. He sort of uses some of the techniques that Hannibal does against the Carthaginians. So he and Fabius, there's kind of a conflict. I think what the story of Scipio shows, though, right, is at the end, really to defeat Hannibal, you would need to have an aggressive strategy, an aggressive
Mm.
general. And he finishes the war by driving Hannibal to North Africa and then defeating Hannibal's army at the Battle of Zama.
Mm. And I think we shall end the episode there. We talked about the result and, of course, the consequences of the Carthaginian, sorry, Punic Wars in the next episode. But because this is such a huge topic, we decided to do this in two parts as well. So we already talked for almost 2 hours now, and I think it's time we're going to end this episode. But I want to ask, and it asked before a kind of what if question. How different do you think the world would have looked if Hannibal had won the Punic Wars?
Yeah, I think it would have looked quite different, right? I mean, especially if Rome sort of lost
Hmm,
its control over Italy, none of the rest of Roman history would have happened, right?
hmm,
Because Rome would have been cut off from its manpower, its armies, right?
hmm.
Its recruiting grounds. It relied
And
so much
Christianity might not have happened.
yeah, so then exactly, then what happens after that, right? If Rome, stays as just cut back to being just a city state in Italy, I mean, it seems unlikely Hannibal felt he could completely eradicate Rome, although this is, as we will discuss, what Rome did to Carthage later.
Yeah.
But the Roman army would have been destroyed. And therefore, really the Roman Empire at this point, as we said, was just Sicily and Sardinia, the very, very light footprint. Little bit of um, entanglements also across the Adriatic Sea because of piracy, but nothing that followed would have happened.
Hmm,
No conquest of Gaul. Spain never would have been conquered, right? Because the Carthage would have kept control of Spain.
hmm.
And so there would be basically no Roman Empire. And as you say, Christianity, right? Certainly it's able to spread because of the connectivity of the Roman Empire.
Mm. And this raises the question, of course, Judaism was kind of a religion at the time. Of course, would the Carthaginians have adapted some sort of Judaism instead of Christianity if they had continued existing as an empire for a political power eventually? Would they speak some sort of Phoenician language what would the writing system look like? Would, kind of some obscure version of, what would for the Phoenician Carthaginian kind of be like in that reality? Would they be kind of the Roman Empire of that timeline in that universe? So it's so many questions that how would the world look like today had the Carthaginians won? It's one of those life-changing events that the defining moments in history actually that when you look back at it.
Absolutely. I mean, war is supremely important, right?
Mm,
Sometimes historians want to say, oh, we talk too much about military history. There are other
yeah.
things, history of religion. But I mean, war really does shape sometimes the destinies
Mm,
of societies. Yeah.
mm,
And I think this is one example, absolutely. And
mm,
and the Romans feel very emboldened after the Second Punic War. We'll talk about this, so they almost immediately go on to invade Macedon.
yeah.
They cross into the Eastern world because Macedon actually made an alliance with Hannibal. They thought, perfect, we can get rid of the Romans together. And the Romans did not forget that. And they went off
Mm,
to the east and, start to develop their empire in the Eastern
mm,
Mediterranean, as well as having conquered Spain and now trying to figure out how to manage that. And these are very big questions for the
yeah.
Romans, right? Even though they're good at fighting wars, They really have to start to figure out how do you run an empire.
Mm. Also, it's interesting that, excuse me, it's also interesting that Rome at the time of Alexander and Philip, it was so insignificant that they didn't even care to conquer Italy or even go to westwards, that they chose to go eastward toward India. And I think it's theorized that had Alexander lived longer, he perhaps would have conquered Italy eventually. So, but it's interesting that it was so low on the radar of Alexander as well that they didn't even bother to conquer Italy. And might just another civilization run later where I conquer Italy as Alexander later on. But yeah, it's interesting that to me that Italy was so insignificant as well, even before they got the Punic Wars.
That's right. Well, if you do the timeline, it's sort of right before this
Yeah,
point that Rome really performs its army and takes over Italy when Alexander is
yeah,
there. But yeah, it makes the point, right? In the Eastern world, Alexander was just the latest of many empires. You have Assyria, you have
yeah.
uh, Persia, the the Babylonians, right? All these different empires. So the East is very used to the idea that you can have lots of wealth and empire and things. The Romans have to invent this more,
Mm. It's
and
also interesting that Persia
people
would
didn't
last
see
for a
it
long,
coming.
long time.
Yeah.
And I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'll conclude the Roman Republic in the next episode. Before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to share and anything you want to promote or on the social media where people can find you or if they have further questions? And of course, where can people find your book, Lawless Republic, the Rise of Cicero and the Decline of Rome? So where do people find the book if they want to read more about that part of the Republic? And of course, I know the things you want to share are links you want me to put in the description. Now is the time to share.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm embarrassed to say I don't do any social media, but I'm very happy for people to read.
Honestly, you're better off these days.
Yeah, I'm very happy for people to read any of the books I've written. A lot of my work really does focus on kind of what happens after the Second Punic War, when we get into to empire and the problems of empire uh, for the Roman government at home. There's lots of conflict. All this money floods in, and you think that's a good thing, but it causes a lot of tension in society. Um, but yeah, I would just recommend if you're interested in Roman history and that period. I've written two books recently. They're both published by Basic Books, available um, easily in digital, audio, print versions in English. And the last one is called Lawless Republic, and it's actually really about the courts of Rome, the criminal trials. What did it mean to go on trial? Who were the lawyers? What strategies did they use? Who were the juries? All these kinds of things. And I tell that story using especially the life of Cicero, who was ancient Rome's greatest lawyer and really became the model that all later Roman lawyers used when
Yeah,
they were arguing their cases. So
we'll of
check
course
that out
touch
if you're
more. Yeah. We will, of course, talk about Cicero in the next episode as well. And again, thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. This has been That Aged Well. My name is Alan. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars and leave a comment. If you are on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. That would be great. If you're on Amazon, you can do that as well. If you're on YouTube, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment as well. Are there other topics of the Roman Republic you want me to cover more in detail? Of course, I will cover more detail with Punic Wars in the future. And of course, stay tuned for part 2, which is coming out next week. And I'm Anand. You can find us on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, and with that H12. Just like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.